Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Nasir Gami. Thanks for joining me today. Apologize for the delay getting going. Um, Today's live stream podcast is going to be on the topic of trauma and PTSD. I'm just going to talk to you about it a little bit, and maybe next time I'll get better at this and can show you a slide or two where things are written up. But for the live stream, I'll just speak, and then once it goes online, we'll have a little bit of maybe some background material and also some links to the things I speak about. So the question that I wanted to discuss now is the issue of what do we mean by trauma? What do we mean when we say someone has trauma and then they have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder? And related, what do we mean by the so-called complex trauma phrase, which we often hear these days? So what I'd like to say is that I think the term trauma needs to be defined more clearly than it often is and more narrowly. People seem to call things traumatic, which are negative life experiences or stresses in life, but they could just be called that, negative life experiences. The term trauma carries other implications. So for instance, traditionally, the idea really comes from the Freudian tradition in psychiatry. And Freud, about 100 years ago, was observing that many of his patients that he saw with hysteria, meaning paralysis of unknown cause, or what we might call conversion symptoms these days, where they have physical symptoms of unknown cause. He felt that as a neurologist, seeing those patients, the cause of those symptoms had to do with unconscious emotional states that related to early childhood experiences, often sexual in nature. And sometimes these childhood experiences were either sexual fantasies or sexual realities. And initially he thought they were real, later he thought they were more fantasies, but in any case involved rather unusual experiences or ideas. And this was not typical. For instance, incest was often part of the issue, and of a father having sexual relations with a daughter. This was not typically experienced, at least in any way that is proven in the majority of human beings. So the concept of trauma had to do with unusual experiences outside of the range of usual human experience, but actually happening. Not that they don't happen, but that they're not common. They're not happening in the majority of people. Over the last 100 years, this idea later got evolved into two big categories. One in the military world was military trauma, combat trauma, and by definition, most people are not soldiers, and most soldiers do not experience combat, and even most combat soldiers don't experience traumatic necessarily, or many of them don't experience traumatic, severe combat experiences. So the idea is it's a minority of people who have certain experiences in the military setting. In World War I, it was called shell shock. In World War II, war neurosis, and after the Vietnam War, with the third edition of the DSM in 1980, they used the phrase post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which has become kind of routine now. After the definition of this, PTSD primarily related to Vietnam veterans in the 1970s, and primarily thinking of it as combat trauma, which automatically takes you in the era of things that are outside the range of usual human experience. The other aspect of it that was brought up was civilian trauma, and the most common civilian trauma was sexual trauma. And since the 70s, 80s, a lot of work has been done on this, which indicates that, for instance, in many Western societies, the experience of sexual trauma is present in about 20% of women and about 5% of men, which is a lot of people, but again, still not 90% of people, not the majority of people. So it's still a common experience relatively, but not a usual experience for everyone. Now, I would contrast that with the concept of negative life experiences. Negative life experiences happen to everybody, 100% of human beings. There's research that's shown, for instance, that in the 6 months before someone has a clinical depression, they tend to have some negative life event. These range from losing a job, losing a relationship, losing a loved one, so a lot of losses, financial stress, marital stress, stress with one's children, with one's parents, with one's friends, so life stresses, and sometimes even the life events are positive ones, like getting a job, but it's experienced in a stressful way, or moving is a very common life experience that happens before a depressive episode, physically just moving from one place to another, one city to another, one home to another. Now, everybody does these things. Everybody moves. Everybody has relationships and loses them. Everybody loses a job or gets a job or has some stress around work. Everybody loses a parent. And medical illness is another stress. Everyone has medical illness. So there's no human being that goes through life without at least one of these negative life experiences. Most of us experience many. That does not make them traumas. It's not trauma in the sense of what Freud describes with his patients with hysteria 100 years ago. It's not trauma in the sense of the combat trauma, which was the basic idea behind PTSD in 1980 with the DSM-3. And it's not the most traumatic kinds of experiences that most people fortunately don't experience, but a substantial minority do, such as sexual trauma. So I would think it's important, and it traditionally has been, to make this distinction between trauma, which is sexual or combat in nature primarily, and negative life experiences, which is not that way. And negative life experiences happens in everyone, and trauma happens in a minority of people. Now, the phrase complex trauma is increasingly used by many people to essentially blur the line between trauma and negative life experiences, and essentially any negative life experience can be interpreted traumatically. For instance, you can have a car accident. A car accident is a trauma, depending on what happens to you, how much you're injured, what you see. One can have nightmares and avoidance feelings about it. But car accidents happen in so many people that if everyone who has a car accident is viewed as having trauma, that extends the concept quite broadly. Many people defend this complex PTSD concept. And the other thing that is relevant is that I think that the concept of trauma and negative life experiences doesn't necessarily transfer to the idea that you will have a psychiatric problem because of that. For instance, yes, 90% of people with depression have these negative life experiences that occur, losses, and stresses. But everybody in the world has those same losses and stresses, but only 10% of the world has a clinical depression. 90% of people never have a clinical depression, despite having those very same losses. Similarly, in post-traumatic stress illness, 85% of people, 85% who experience trauma do not develop PTSD. Only 15% develop PTSD. So the mere existence of the trauma doesn't translate to the diagnosis of PTSD, even if one has a severe trauma. And similarly, the existence of life stresses doesn't translate either to complex trauma, quote unquote, or people will often say it's situational depression or reactive depression because someone has depression with life events. Well, everybody has those life events. Why does that person have a depression and the other person doesn't? And the answer is because of their underlying biological susceptibility. Not that psychosocial stressors don't matter, they do, but they are not the sole causes of depression. They are triggers of the underlying biological susceptibility, which is necessary for the depression. In other words, you have to have the biology to have the depression. You don't have to have the psychosocial stressors. You might not. But if you have the psychosocial stressors, without the biology, you won't have depression. So depression is necessary, maybe not sufficient for depression. The biology of depression is necessary, though not sufficient for depression. Whereas life events may be sufficient, but they're not necessary for depression. And what's necessary is more central. That is the underlying biology. Same thing with PTSD. Of course, you have to have a trauma to diagnose PTSD. By definition, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. But since 85% of people don't have PTSD, there's something else that's relevant too. Again, it could be underlying biology, it could be personality traits. For instance, we know that people who have neuroticism, high neuroticism is a personality trait, which is high anxiety, they're more likely to develop PTSD after a trauma than people who have low neuroticism. People who have hyperthymia, manic symptoms as part of their personality, are less likely to develop PTSD than people who don't have hyperthymia after the same trauma, for instance, combat experiences. A lot of this research, by the way, has been done after civilian traumas like 9/11 in Manhattan. A lot of work was done there, which came up with these numbers of about 85% of people not having PTSD after experiencing a major traumatic event such as that. Now, it is important to distinguish PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, with acute stress disorder or acute stress syndrome. So yes, everybody who was in 9/11 felt terrible for a few months or whatever, but 85% of those people no longer met any PTSD-like criteria after 6 months. So the first 6 months is a normal period, more or less, for a stress reaction where one is anxious, sad, maybe even has flashbacks, nightmares. But this declines over 6 months. And the PTSD is something you diagnose in someone where it persists more than 6 months, more than a year, and it becomes a lifelong problem. Again, that only happens in about 15% of people. So the problem we run into is that many clinicians who like to diagnose PTSD, like to diagnose complex trauma, will take anybody with a history of trauma and then ascribe any problem they have 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, such as a depressive period, to the trauma they had 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Whereas in the meantime, they had been well for some years. That's not PTSD. If it was PTSD, they would have had the trauma, they would have the acute stress syndrome, and they would have had the PTSD persisting long-term after that. Although it is sometimes delayed, maybe in some cases there can be a delayed presentation. My point is, one shouldn't always view it as an automatic, that if the trauma occurs, you diagnose PTSD. Remember, in 85% of people, you probably shouldn't do that. And similarly, people will diagnose complex trauma because everyone has life stresses in life. And for those who have depressive episodes or such, that gets attributed to the so-called complex trauma, and maybe the underlying biological mood illness is not diagnosed. That's a common mistake and problem, I think, in some scenarios. Now, of course, one can have a biological mood illness and have PTSD. You can have both. You can have just one or the other. But I think it's important to distinguish which is which. And I think the overly broad trauma concept can be a problem in that respect. Now, another thing I'd like to say about the concept of PTSD is that it is a scenario where trauma is required as part of the diagnosis. But a lot of times people diagnose related conditions like borderline personality, for instance. And in the DSM system, PTSD is an exception where the DSM system allows for something to be causal. You have to have the trauma to have the post-traumatic state. But in borderline personality, they didn't found the leaders of the DSM-3 and 4 and 5 specifically excluded trauma as a criterion for borderline personality because they were following the general DSM perspective that they wanted to not make ascriptions of etiology, not suggest causes for anything. And so sexual trauma was excluded, even though the whole concept of borderline personality grew out of the observation over decades and decades in psychoanalytic treatment in the 1950s and 60s. The idea that grew out of that was that people who had early childhood sexual trauma seemed to develop this borderline picture. They said classically it was the pre-Oedipal phase, below age 5. If they had some sexual trauma between, say, age 2 and 4, then that would interfere with their personality development, and they would not have the standard personality relationships that most people have, and they would develop all these features that are classically associated with borderline personality, such as an all good, all bad approach to people, having a lot of anger and aggression, as well as self-hatred. All these features were thought to grow out of early childhood sexual trauma in the pre-Oedipal phase. This was viewed as causal for the concept of borderline personality. Well, what DSM-3 in 1980 did is it took all of the symptoms and it took away the cause. It took this whole psychoanalytic Freudian concept accepted it completely without any scientific evidence, by the way, that it's a legitimate idea. It's a psychoanalytic Freudian idea, which is not to say it's false, but it hasn't been proven scientifically to be valid, as we've discussed in other settings and we'll keep discussing. But it took all the symptomatic presentation and it took away the cause, the idea of an early childhood sexual trauma. So if you look at the DSM criteria for borderline personality now, you have to have 6 out of 9 criteria. None of them involve trauma. So you can basically diagnose borderline personality with having mood swings, unstable interpersonal relationships, anger and aggression, occasional suicidality, and feelings of emptiness and such. It's very easy to diagnose it without any of the classic symptoms of borderline personality from the past, and rather using these non-specific symptoms which overlap with mood illness, leading to this unnecessary debate about whether a patient has, for instance, bipolar illness or borderline personality. It would be like saying, oh, it's really difficult to differentiate migraine from, I don't know, from orthopedic pain because they both have pain. And oh, let's just focus on the pain instead of focusing on the things that are different. If you focus on what's different, you'll see that in borderline personality, people have dissociative states, self-mutilation, and a history of sexual trauma. These things differentiate them from people with bipolar illness who don't have dissociative states, by and large, infrequently have sexual mutilation, and who don't have sexual trauma as a history any more than the general population rate, which is about 20%. In borderline personality, even with the DSM diagnosis, which doesn't require it, 2/3 of the people meeting the DSM definition have sexual trauma, 2/3 have sexual self-mutilation, and about that percentage as well have dissociative states. And the percentages for those things in bipolar illness is 20% or much less, so a good deal less. So I think the idea of trauma as being central to borderline personality is an important idea, but I also think we need to define it as it classically was defined in this more severe and extreme way. And I also think the idea of trauma as being central to PTSD obviously makes sense, again, with the same restriction to more severe trauma, and also appreciating the fact that the majority of people don't actually develop PTSD after such trauma, so it shouldn't be an automatic diagnosis. And furthermore, I think we need to make the distinction between severe trauma, really classical trauma, one might say real trauma, and this watered down notion of complex trauma, which again has not been proven or validated as scientifically legitimate in any way, is merely an opinion, and overlaps with what's always been considered to be negative life experiences, which is common in psychiatric illness, but also common outside of psychiatric illness, and therefore not itself causal in any kind of automatic way. So those are some thoughts I wanted to share with you about PTSD and trauma and such. And on the live stream, we always have the option for a few comments from the audience, and we're coming up on kind of the end of what I wanted to share with you today. So if there are any comments, questions, feel free to put it in on the live stream, and I'll answer them for you. In the meantime, while I wait to see if you comment on that, I will put up a few links on the YouTube site to some of the literature that I'm referring to on some of these issues. And you'll be able to see the replay there if you like, or look at the links if you like. And please share and subscribe to the channel if you like the discussions that we're having. I'm not seeing any comments coming up, but I appreciate those of you who joined me on the live stream today out of your busy lives. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining me.